Hi and welcome. My name is Ron Keogh. I'm a solutions architect with Tufin. This is the third installment of the webinar series, Eliminating Manual Firewall Management Tasks. Today, we're going to be talking about firewall teams doing audits in hours instead of days. And we're going to be talking about Tufin's advanced audit readiness capabilities and how it will help the firewall teams and network operations teams to both be prepared for and, more importantly, I imagine, responsive to audit requests, without creating an all-hands-on-deck event. As you know, in today's world of rapidly evolving compliance requirements, preparing for audits can be a daunting task, and it also can be quite time-consuming. And as we have our resources already stretched, having them dedicated to preparing for audits is not really an efficient use of their time. So with Tufin's comprehensive suite of audit readiness features, you can ensure that your organization is always prepared to pass even the most rigorous audits with ease. So we're going to take a closer look about how Tufin can help you achieve true audit readiness. So today the agenda is we're going to be talking about some of the obstacles to audit readiness, and I imagine some of you will understand these and perhaps see the same ones in your organization. And then we're going to talk about the journey. We're going to go through this a little quickly, but we'll talk about the journey to continuous compliance automation. And what does that look like, and what does it buy you? The benefits of Tufin for audit readiness. And then we're going to have a demonstration of some of Tufin's features for audit readiness. Then we have a couple of case studies to talk about a couple of organizations that have been using Tufin and really how they've been able to improve their environment, and also how has this helped them when it comes to time to being prepared for an audit. Towards the end, we're going to have an overview of Tufin for those that may not know us. It'll be a very short conversation about Tufin, and then finally Q&A. And by the way, if you have any questions, please push the Q&A button in front of you, and you'll go ahead, and then we'll have those questions answered later on, time permitting. All right, so some of the obstacles to audit readiness, right? What are we looking at there? One of the ones here is this whole idea about a multi-vendor environment, right? We don't have an environment anymore where we have, say, a single vendor that rules our entire network. We may have different firewall vendors, we might be using different cloud infrastructure, whatever it is. We now have a position where we're using kind of best of breed, and that does create its own challenge, right? And also, if we want to compound that with this constantly evolving threat landscape, it really makes it difficult to keep up with new risks. And ultimately, audit is about ensuring that the program that we're managing is helping to reduce and eliminate risk. So that's one of the areas, multi-vendor environment. The other one is fragmented visibility. This kind of goes hand in hand with the multi-vendor environment. When you have different environments, we have cloud, we have different firewall vendors, we have different SDN solutions, whatever it happens to be, they each have their own console. And now we get into the process of swivel chair management, and that becomes very both time consuming and problematic because, it's hard to find individuals skilled at every single management platform that's out there. So what we end up seeing is that with this fragmented visibility, because visibility is what the premise of security is, you have visibility. With this fragmented visibility and over these various policies and where they're being enforced, this leads to compliance gaps and potentially to vulnerabilities in your environment. The other thing that we see, a lot of the customers that come and see us is that they're using a manual process. And that manual process, for instance, when it comes to measuring risk, sometimes it's a very subjective means of measuring risk, and it's not well documented. When it comes to storing audit artifacts, security artifacts, they're using tools like spreadsheets or email messages. So, it's not necessarily the best way of doing things. Some organizations, that's how they grew. They started very small, but then you get to a certain point of maturity where that's no longer going to be valid. So manual changes in spreadsheets is not the best way to manage your environment. Then again, as your organization becomes larger and more complex, doing the simple things become difficult. So, lack of policy hygiene. If you don't have visibility across your entire environment, you can't see that you have to do cleanups or, unused rules or disabled rules, or for that matter, rules that haven't been, or have violations. They violate my compliance and I have to correct them. If I don't have that visibility, to be able to go through and clean up those rules and correct them and remediate them, that's not good, right? It's going to be a problem and really increases the attack surface. So, some of the simple things need to be done as well. And then, at the end of the day, also, when you're dealing with audit, you have to be able to provide, a documentation trail that changes that were implemented were both reviewed for risk, that the changes were approved, and actually go a step further, the changes, at each step of the change that we had the appropriate oversight necessary for that change to be implemented. So having that documented, if you're in a very busy environment, you're making a lot of changes, it's difficult to keep accurate documentation. And because you want to be responsive to the business, part of the problem is you will be responsive to the business, and what ends up sacrificing is security. And security is going to be the lack of documentation. We're not going to have evidence to prove that we've actually properly vetted every single change as it's being implemented in our environment. And then the last thing here, of course, would be the idea of producing reports, right? You need to produce reports to auditors. They want to be able to see the appropriate level of change control. They want to see risk assessments. Everything that you're doing that you must be able to produce readily, and having that information at your fingertips. Depending on the type of audit will depend on the type of reports that you're going to need to produce. So let's go to the next step here, and let's talk a little bit about really, what does that journey to continuous compliance automation look like, right? So to organizations that adopt a solution like Tufin, what they end up getting is the ability to, first off, define a global policy based on their existing configuration. So they can take a look at their environment and say, I know what my policy should look like. But when they get that visibility, the other thing they're able to do is, and this is covered again in the previous webinar, they're able to do cleanups, right? Let's reduce the attack surface. Let's get rid of unused rules. Let's get rid of rules that are shadowed. Let's get rid of these rules that violate policy. Get rid of them all. So we want to make sure that we have good hygiene when it comes to our rule set, and then again, reduce the attack surface. Part of this, again, is optimizing your policies, making sure you're not creating a new rule for every single change. And let's identify those overly permissive rules and maybe remediate them by understanding what traffic is going through them and making them more precise, more granular, and less overly permissive. And this goes to the other part, centralized segmentation management, right? We have a segmentation policy that we want to make sure that we are measuring, we are measuring across our hybrid environment, that we are measuring each security policy on different devices, different firewalls, in the cloud, whatever it happens to be, that we are effectively measuring the segmentation policy to make sure that those devices are following our corporate mandate when it comes to segmentation. What's allowed to talk to what, who's allowed to talk to who, and how. Okay. And then, of course, the journey goes on to automated changes. And, this is when we now start getting, ahead of the game, right? So far, everything has been kind of reactionary. We are measuring risk. We are doing all these things properly, but the risk is already in our network. Now we get ahead of the problem by automating the network changes. And we're able to go through and identify if making a change will introduce risk to the environment. So now we get more into a preventative control. And then continuous policy monitoring and violation alerting, right? Whenever there's a violation, we want to know about it immediately. And then we want to be able to take remedial action. We don't want to have to run a report to see if we're out of compliance. We want the system to tell us automatically, we have a problem, we need to correct it right away. And then, with CI/CD pipeline, when we take a look at the rapid development and the rapid deployment of changes through CI/CD, basically shifting security to the left, allowing the guardrails to be established within those workloads such that we are now not hindering the developers. We are actually allowing them to operate within guardrails, and that they will deploy code that's going to follow the recommendations of the guardrails, and otherwise we'll be able to identify violations to that. So what are the outcomes of this, right? Well, part of the outcome is if you're doing audit properly and you're constantly measuring compliance, you're going to reduce risk, right? Because you're not going to have, for instance, rules that aren't being used. You're going to be doing automated cleanup. You're going to be measuring compliance all the time, so you're not going to have risky rules that are out there. So risk reduction, that's important. Faster, safer application delivery. As we just mentioned, by establishing the guardrails earlier, it allows the developers to be able to automatically develop, provision changes, so they can automatically provision the changes necessary for their applications to operate, but also to make sure that they are operating within the guardrails established. Increase operational efficiency without headcount. As your organization grows, solutions, automated solutions scale automatically. So they're able to scale out to be able to meet even the largest organizations today. And doing that with people is just not practical nor cost effective. And of course, the fringe benefit here is your audit is going to be ready all the time. You can demonstrate through continuous compliance monitoring that you are audit ready all the time. Faster, safer digital transformation, reduce costs with fewer outages and failed audits, right? And when we take a look at failed audits, there are costs associated with that, which are real. For instance, energy companies, when we look at NERC-CIP compliance, some of those fines can be $1 million per day per violation. So it's real costs involved there. And then the other thing is, by having an automated solution, it allows silo teams to actually work together. So NetOps works with DevOps, works with information security, works with compliance. So everybody now is working from a common platform that allows everybody's interests to be met. So we're going to have a quick demonstration of the Tufin solution right now so that you can better understand some of these conditions that I've just talked about. Okay, so what you see before you is the Tufin dashboard. And as we were talking about earlier, we talked about the swivel chair management and how lack of visibility or fragmented visibility can negatively impact your ability to be able to respond to audits. And what you're seeing here is how Tufin handles that. So Tufin is able to provide that level of visibility, really from this one dashboard, that you can see all the rules on all your devices, irrespective of where they live. I have, in my example, I have some 5,969 rules that are spread across 125 devices, all visible from a single dashboard. So I'm not logging into that console or this cloud instance and so on. It's all available to me right away. And then, again, when we talk about cleanup, right? And I'm not going to go into that. This was in part of a previous webinar. But, the fact that we can see those areas for cleanup, how are we doing right now from a cleanup perspective? What needs attention immediately? And more importantly, how am I trending in cleanups, right? Over the last year, or year to date, I should say, maybe last year. Last year, how am I doing overall with my cleanup trending? I hope I'm trending down, that I'm seeing less and less cleanups required. And here I happen not to be, so I've got to, pick up my game and make sure that we're addressing this a little bit faster. But, when we talk about compliance, we talk about the continuous compliance, right? Making sure that we're doing risk measurement, right? And some organizations, that risk measurement is being done in a very subjective way. And Tufin's measurement of risk is very objective. We have a mechanism that we refer to as the Unified Security Policy. And the Unified Security Policy is essentially a document that describes your segmentation policy for your organization. Now, your segmentation policy may be driven by some sort of regulatory control like PCI, maybe driven by something more along the lines of a best practice like ISO 27000, or it might just be your own corporate best practices, right? Whatever it is, it gives you the ability to formally document what your segmentation policy looks like. And you can see here a whole bunch of different policies in front of me. This is just from my demonstration system. You wouldn't have this many. But let's go ahead and take a look at one of them just to see what it looks like. So this is a matrix that's going to describe how parts of my network are able to communicate with other parts of my network. Okay, so I have different areas of my network. I have a control center, a corporate network, a DMZ network, and so on. And you'll notice that these are repeated across the top. And where they intersect, the intersection point describes how one segment is allowed to communicate with another segment. So for instance, from my DMZ to my control center, I'm allowing nothing, which is to say that I don't want to see any firewall rules, any network security policy rules that allow my DMZ networks to communicate with my control center. If somebody was to go into my firewall, as an example, and create that access, this would be measured against this matrix immediately, and a violation would be generated immediately. So this is what I mean by continuous compliance monitoring. We know immediately when we're out of compliance. So we can say access is not allowed, or maybe access is allowed, but very specific access. So here, for instance, from my corporate network going to my control center, I'm going to allow RDP and SSH only. If somebody was to create a rule that allowed, let's say, Telnet as an example, that would be considered a violation because it's not one of the allowable protocols. So again, this is a detective control right now because We are measuring after the fact. Somebody makes a change. After the fact, we get notified of the change. We read that change in. We do it very rapidly, but it's still, we have a violation. We still have a problem in our network. When we start taking a look at automation, on the other hand, we start taking a look at having your changes made to your environment through an automation solution. Now we start getting into a preventative control. And let's take a look at that really quickly. So I've just switched over from what is known as Secure Track, which is our compliance measurement capability, into Secure Change now, which is our automation capability, our orchestration and automation engine within Tufin. And what you're looking at is a change request that's in flight. Okay, so we have different stages of the change request, and we're seeing that up top here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And this first stage was the actual request coming in. So the source going to the destination over all these different service ports. The second stage was going to be the business approval stage. And we can see that we are capturing the artifacts of who approved this change. So we know that the handler was Henry Carr, the approval was done, and the change was approved. And again, this is just an example, right? The third stage is an automated stage, and this stage is where Tufin decided, based on the source and destinations involved, what are the different technologies that are in that path. So we can see we have the NSX distributed firewall, we have an NSXT distributed firewall, and we also have a checkpoint gateway that happen to be in the path. And that's determined automatically. The fourth stage is where we did our risk assessment. So in this case, we're doing something referred to as an extended risk assessment, right? And I'll explain to you what that looks like. And the fifth stage, we now determine as to whether or not we have risk. And we can see we do have risk. So this request has risk associated with it. And let's take a look at what risk was found. So we'll look at the bottom part first. So using the unified security policy, that matrix that we just talked about, Tufin was able to determine that if I implement this change, I'm going to be violating my unified security policy. And these are the security requirements, right? We can see that both requirements from different zone matrices are identifying networks that are not supposed to communicate. So based on our understanding of the environment, we decided that somebody is trying to create access that should never be allowed. So now we've gone from being a detective control into a preventative control. We are measuring that risk right now before the change gets implemented, right? So now we're getting ahead of the problem. And this would allow somebody to step in and say, nope, we're not making this change. Or, yes, we have to make the change, so we'll create an exception to document the fact that we're allowing this, right? And also the other part of doing this is it takes risk measurement away from being a subjective means of measuring risk and more into an objective way of measuring risk. We're measuring risk. We have it documented how we're measuring it. We're measuring risk the same way every time. So at the end of the day, what we have is a documented and a repeatable process when it comes to measuring risk. You know, that's music to an auditor's ears. Now, the other part up top here is the second capability that we have. And this is the ability to integrate with third-party products. In this case, we're integrating with a vulnerability scanning system. It could have been Qualys, it could have been Tenable, name your vulnerability scanner. And what we're doing is we're asking that scanner, what do you know about the devices that are involved in this change? Are there any vulnerabilities there? And if there are, would making this change expose that vulnerability, hence creating a risk? So it's really a two-faceted risk. One, based on whether or not these networks should communicate at all. And two, based on the fact that even if they were allowed to communicate, would creating that path, would that be introducing risk to the environment? So again, this is very difficult to do manually. This is something that automation does perfectly, and it does it fast. So we're not sacrificing business agility. We are maintaining business agility, but we are also maintaining security because we're able to measure risk in real time and very quickly. Okay, so we can go on all day about this. It'd be a very long demo, unfortunately, but this just talks a little bit about Tufin's ability to assist in continuous compliance. And just as we saw before, back at the dashboard, one thing is to be able to tell an auditor how you're measuring risk, how you're doing things, but the other thing is to be able to demonstrate the effectiveness of the program. So we do have compliance trends as well, and we can measure them over a period of time. And we can see that over the last 2 years, for instance, how is my risk overall doing? And we can see that overall risk has reduced, maybe not as much as we'd like, but we're seeing an improvement in the program. And therefore, I'm able to demonstrate to an auditor that the program is effective and is working. Okay? So again, quick demonstration of a little part of Tufin's ability to measure risk, to keep you compliant through continuous compliance, and to be able to demonstrate to auditors that you're doing that. Okay, so let's continue then. That was our demonstration, and now let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of case studies that we have. So the first case study is a top 20 global bank, and they had the following challenges. Visibility. All right, so they required visibility across 33 firewalls from 2 different vendors that they were implementing in their environment. And this visibility spanned some 40 countries. All right. The other challenge they had was automation. They wanted to automate their rule recertification and change workflows. And for those that aren't familiar with rule recertification, this is something that we covered off in the last webinar. But essentially, it is the practice of having rules reviewed periodically to ensure that they're still serving some sort of business function. So this particular bank wanted to go through and have that automation done for rule recertification and change workflows as well. Okay. And the third challenge they had is they wanted to eliminate manual tasks, right? As we know, manual tasks are time consuming, and the only thing you can do to fix it is to either automate it or throw a lot of bodies at it. And throwing a lot of bodies at it is not necessarily the best way of doing things. So they wanted to eliminate manual tasks and to document and improve compliance with both NIST 853 and, of course, PCI DSS. Okay. So what happened? Let's take a look. So the results were they were able to automate the management of some 4,000 plus rules. Right? So a sizable number of rules. They got rid of the spreadsheets that they had been using. So now they went away from having these sort of like decentralized documentation of what rules are there for, why they're there, and they got away from that, and they had it all centralized within Tufin. And more importantly, they also went through an automatic daily rule review, right? Because they were able to free up some resources because of automation, they were able to better utilize those resources who were better able to utilize the automation. And now, as opposed to doing reviews just before an auditor comes in or when time permits, they were able to actually create a daily review. So they were looking for areas for cleanup, rules that haven't been hit, rules that have shadowed, those sort of things. And they're able to clean them up. And so, and on top of that, they were also able to enable a continuous compliance, which allows them to be able to be audit ready all the time. So audit prep was a piece of cake because they had the full history of every change that was being made, and they also had good evidence that showed that they were measuring risk the same way every single time. So very important. So the future is now they're going to take it a step further for their change requests, right? So far the changes have been around, automation has been around rule recertification and cleanups, but now they're going to go through, and the future is user submits a request into their ITSM like they do today, and everything on the back side is done by Tufin. Tufin becomes that black box that goes through and accepts the change, evaluates the change, automatically identifies what needs to be updated and how, automatically designs the change, takes a look at the change to make sure it's not going to introduce risk either from a vulnerability being exposed or it's not going to create risk from the perspective of allowing networks that should not talk to talk. All being done in minutes. So that's a great, compelling story. And having a full audit trail of every single change that's done, extensive change control, documenting who made the change, who approved it, all those artifacts automatically stored by Tufin. Okay. And as the manager of network security said, there was an instant benefit from using this capability. All right. Not surprisingly, with solutions like Tufin, we tend to be very popular in heavily regulated industries. And, those are going to be financial institutions, but also utility companies. We do have a large number of utility companies that use Tufin today. So this case study too was a large utility company, and their challenges were they wanted faster network access changes across some 2,500 plus devices. They had a 2-month lead time and a large backlog for changes, right? As you can imagine across that kind of environment. And of course, given the scrutiny that utility companies have to deal with. So they have to be very, very cautious when they're making changes. And they wanted to automation and streamlining of compliance tasks. When we look at utility companies, NERC-CIP is, top of mind, and they have a hybrid architecture. So they had very, very stringent regulatory demands of them, but they also had a very large and complex network. And so they wanted to be able to, take them a long time to prep for audits, given the complexity of the environment. It was taking them 40 people to keep up with the workload, right? Again, throwing people at the problem is not the best solution. It's just never going to scale appropriately. So, and in this case, they had high skilled and certified firewall admins, to do this sort of work, right? So it's a difficult type of person to find, right? Let alone getting them, finding them is going to be the key thing here. So it's not it wasn't a very practical environment in which they were in. And then also when they had issues, they needed to have a faster root cause to identify and handle network outages. And in fact, during the proof of value with this customer, I recall that they did have an outage, and would be an outage that they would said would have taken days to find, that they were able to find with minutes with Tufin. So automation has more than just, being audit ready. Hey, it also allows you to solve some problems, right? So the result were network changes now were being done in days instead of weeks or months with Tufin. It dramatically reduced the amount of time and effort required to manage the firewall rules and change requests. Workloads that would take 40 people now take 5 people to implement. So, quite a 1/8 number of people left to be able to do that. So it's pretty impressive. Automated streamline compliance efforts, right? Immediate visibility into the portal, able to identify shadowed rules, able to identify rules that are not compliant. This would allow them to immediately remediate these issues by 80%. They were very good about measuring, using metrics to measure success with the Tufin product. And as they said, and I will read this, we saved countless hours on rule cleanup and compliance reporting, and we gave management visibility without pulling one of our valuable team members from critical tasks. So better able to use your existing resources, but also able to provide that level of visibility to management and auditors as well. And also ensuring uninterrupted business business continuity, right? So during outages, Tufin's path analysis capability allows the operators to quickly identify where a blockage is and reduce time to resolution by over 50%. Okay. In the future, they're going to be integrating NextSAP and DevOps processes. They want to continually reduce their SLAs. Not part of this company, but another one I know where they've, this is a financial institution. When they first went into Tufin, they were looking at 2 weeks to make a change. They got it down to 2 days, and their next step is getting it down to 2 minutes. So really, once you have automation in place, and of course, like anything else, you want to trust it. So once you trust it, it starts to reap benefits. All right. So the value becomes apparent when a workload that took 40 people now takes 5. Enough said there. So as we're drawing towards the end here, before we go to Q&A, just talk a little bit about Tufin. We've been talking about the product a bit, but we are the network security policy company. We are the leader in our space. We have over 500 employees worldwide. We have over half of the Fortune 50. We excel in very large and complex networks. And what we do is we allow for business agility without sacrificing security. And we allow for security without sacrificing business agility. It's a company that's been around since 2005, and just a really, really great solution to allow large, complex organizations, to really reap the benefit of automation.